In the deadly, freezing wasteland of Zalnith 5, a group of elite cadets is tested like never before, battling a storm so fierce it could claim their lives. Stranded, vulnerable, and underprepared, one human cadet rises above the odds, proving that survival isn't just about technology, but the strength of will. Will he and his team make it through? Or will nature's fury be too much to overcome? If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and give us a thumbs up. Now, let's jump into the story. The shuttle door hissed open with a mechanical groan, the sudden rush of frigid air from Zalnith 5 seeping into the cabin. The temperature outside was far colder than anything any of the cadets had ever faced. As the others began to file out, their boots crunching softly against the frozen landscape, a sharp gust of wind cut through the shuttle, carrying the distinct smell of ice and ozone. Each cadet was equipped with a state-of-the-art survival suit tailored to their species. Some wore iridescent membranes that shimmered in the pale sunlight. Others had heat-reactive scales, and some floated effortlessly in the air, their anti-gravity technology keeping them above the snow. But Joran was different. He stood alone, at the back of the line, watching the others confidently step into the harsh world beyond. His equipment was far from sophisticated. His suit, a basic Earth standard issue, lacked the advanced features that the alien cadets had. The strap of his survival pack was fraying, and his gloves, thick but clumsy, made him feel more vulnerable than prepared. One by one, the cadets began to activate their shelters, systems humming to life around them. Joran, however, felt no comfort in the high-tech displays of shelter domes and self-assembling structures. His task was much more basic: survive. As his boots sank into the thick snow, Joran tugged the hood of his jacket tighter around his face and squinted against the brightness of the twin suns reflecting off the frozen surface. His breath immediately fogged in the thin, dry air, and he felt the cold bite through his layers. While the others had tech that could regulate temperature, moisture, and oxygen, Joran only had his wits and the basic survival knowledge taught to him back on Earth. It wasn't enough to make him feel confident, but it was enough to give him hope. He glanced around, noting the advanced shelters forming effortlessly around him. The towering Siler, whose translucent skin seemed to glow under the sunlight, quickly set up a compact, automated dome, while Trax, from a species that could manipulate magnetic fields, created a shimmering shield of protective energy that encapsulated his camp. Nearby, the Ilara twins activated their anti-gravity harnesses and hovered a few inches above the ground, their shelters blooming into existence from vapor that condensed around them like a second skin. Even the insectoid Vlerick, with its complex, multifaceted eyes, buzzed with excitement as it inflated a sleek, hexagonal structure that resembled a giant hive. Then there was Joran. He unrolled a tarp from his pack and laid it down awkwardly, feeling the biting wind cut through his layers. His shelter, if it could even be called that, was nothing more than a patch of snow with a thin piece of fabric stretched over it. While others were secure within their technological marvels, Joran was left to build his shelter the only way he knew how, by digging into the snow and hoping that the earth below could provide some insulation. His hands worked quickly, but clumsily, fumbling with his tools. As he labored in the snow, he could feel the eyes of the other cadets on him. They were polite enough to keep their thoughts to themselves, but Joran could see the way they glanced. His way, some with mild curiosity, others with barely concealed disdain. One cadet, a towering reptilian named Mirax, had openly questioned during orientation why a human was even allowed to take part in such a test. Joran had kept his mouth shut then, just like he did now. He didn't care about their opinions. He only cared about surviving the next 48 hours. The cold wind began to pick up as Joran worked, and a low rumble echoed across the planet's frozen surface. He didn't need to be told what was coming. He could feel the temperature plummet even further. The calm that had filled the air earlier was quickly replaced by a biting chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. The storm was coming, and it was going to be fierce. The others didn't seem concerned. Their shelters were already in place, their technology humming softly as they adjusted the settings. But Joran knew that none of that mattered if the storm turned violent. It was in moments like these that raw survival instincts mattered more than anything else. He worked faster, digging deeper into the snow to create a small depression, just big enough to shelter his body. He didn't know what he would need yet, but he knew that he couldn't afford to wait for the storm to arrive. As the wind began to pick up, swirling snow into the air in wild, unpredictable gusts, Joran felt the first sting of cold against his face. His fingers, despite the thick gloves, were already beginning to go numb. He moved quickly, laying the tarp over the hole he had dug and weighing it down with rocks to prevent it from blowing away. The snow around him had become an obstacle, piling up as the wind howled and whistled through the frozen landscape. He felt a shadow pass over him and looked up to see Callan, another cadet from a species that thrived in colder environments, towering over him. His breath formed icy clouds in the air as he gave a low chuckle. "You digging in the snow, human? Are you sure that's your best option?" Callan's voice was dripping with sarcasm. "You really think your Earthways are enough for a test like this?" Joran didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew what the others thought of him. He didn't belong here. He wasn't as fast, as efficient, or as technologically advanced as the others. But Joran wasn't here to prove them wrong. He was here to survive. As the storm began to rage around him, he only focused on one thing: keeping himself alive long enough to make it through the night. As the first flakes of snow began to fall, the winds howling louder, Joran crawled into his makeshift shelter, feeling the warmth of his body begin to press against the cold walls of his snow hole. The storm was just beginning, but he had taken the first step. His breath was shallow, his muscles sore, but he knew that if he could keep his shelter intact long enough, if he could survive the first 48 hours, it would prove something. Not to the cadets around him, but to himself. The storm outside raged on, and Joran closed his eyes, curling into the snow for warmth, knowing this was just the beginning of the battle for survival. The storm arrived suddenly, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. 1 minute, the air was still, the sky clear, with the twin suns casting a soft, almost serene glow over the icy landscape. The next, the wind howled, tearing through the snowfields like a ferocious beast unleashed. Joran lay curled in his snow shelter, listening to the first distant moan of the storm, knowing it was only the beginning. His heart pounded in his chest as the wind picked up, howling louder, the pressure on his makeshift shelter mounting with each passing minute. His body was cold, his muscles stiff from hours of lying motionless, but he knew he had to keep still. The wind outside howled, a harsh, guttural sound, as if the planet itself was alive and angry. From his small, cramped snow hole, Joran could hear the sounds of the other cadets' shelters being assaulted. The high-tech domes and shields around them began to flicker and whine, their automated systems struggling against the brutal force of nature. He could feel the weight of the wind pressing against the fragile fabric of his tarp, the snow outside, swirling in sheets, making it impossible to see even a few feet beyond the entrance. Joran's breath came out in sharp, freezing puffs as the temperature continued to drop. He pulled his arms tighter around his body, trying to conserve whatever warmth he had left. His gloves were soaked through from the snow he had been digging, and he could already feel his fingers beginning to stiffen. The wind outside howled even louder now, the sound like a warning. A distant rumble echoed from the jagged mountains far in the distance, and then, without warning, a blinding flash of light split the sky. The magnetic pulse of the storm hit, with the force of a punch, crackling through the air with a deafening roar. Joran's shelter, made of nothing more than snow and fabric, trembled as the pulse passed overhead, a shockwave that sent a tremor through the ground beneath him. His teeth clenched as he squeezed his eyes shut, the noise ringing in his ears. The sky above him flickered, and then everything went quiet. For a brief moment, Joran dared to hope that the storm had passed. But the silence was short-lived. In an instant, the winds picked up again, fiercer than before. The air was thick with snow, swirling around him in violent gusts that stung his skin like tiny needles. He could barely see the tip of his own boot in the howling whiteout, let alone the other cadets. Joran reached for his emergency monitor, his fingers numb and sluggish, and checked the readings. The outside temperature had dropped to an unbearable 60 degrees Celsius, and the wind speed was nearing 100 kilometers per hour. He tried to push the fear from his mind, knowing that panic would do him no good. The storm was far from over, and the others were already struggling. He could hear the sounds of chaos outside. The thrum of the Elara twins' anti-gravity suits had stopped, replaced by the sound of something metallic breaking apart. A scream echoed through the storm, high-pitched and panicked. It was Tira, the insectoid cadet with multifaceted eyes, whose shelter had failed. Joran winced at the sound, but he didn't move. There was nothing he could do. The storm was relentless, a swirling, suffocating vortex that seemed to tear at the very fabric of existence. He kept his eyes on the tarp above him, the only thing standing between him and the merciless cold. Time passed in a haze of blinding snow, the storm never ceasing. Joran's mind raced as he thought about the others. The cadets had trained for situations like this, but none of them had been prepared for the brutal reality of surviving in an environment like Salnath 5. Their tech, advanced as it was, had its limits. He could hear the sounds of metal and energy systems failing, shelters flickering out one by one. Joran shivered, not just from the cold, but from the realization that some of the cadets wouldn't make it. He listened intently, straining to hear over the roar of the storm. Through the biting wind, he could make out a faint, desperate noise. Someone was calling out. The sound was faint, weak, and cut off by a series of violent coughs. Joran's heart skipped a beat. Someone was out there, and they needed help. He hesitated for only a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His shelter was barely holding, and every inch of his body screamed for warmth. But if someone else was out there, in the storm, Joran couldn't just sit there. With his body aching from the cold, Joran forced himself to move, dragging his stiff legs out of his shelter and into the storm. The cold struck him like a physical blow as he fought his way through the snow, the wind biting into his face, making it hard to breathe. The world around him was a blur of white, but he kept moving, following the sound of the faint cries. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from the raw determination that fueled him to keep going. Through the snow, he saw a shape, Kaldor. A tall cadet from the stone-skinned species was struggling to move, his large body hunched against the wind. Joran's breath hitched as he realized that Kaldor was dragging someone behind him, Solara, the cadet with 8 limbs, who had been a natural leader in the early days of training. Now she lay limp in the snow, her body weak from the cold. Kaldor was trying to pull her, but his movements were sluggish and pained without thinking. Joran rushed toward them. His breath came in ragged gasps as he grabbed Kaldor's arm and helped him pull Solara closer to the shelter. The snow had piled up around them, making it nearly impossible to move. Every step was a struggle, the wind threatening to tear them apart. But Joran refused to stop. With all his strength, he helped drag Solara to safety, pulling her into the shelter he had so hastily built earlier. Kaldor followed them in, collapsing beside the others, exhausted and freezing. The storm outside was still raging, But inside, Joran had managed to save them, at least for now. His muscles ached from the effort, but the warmth of his shelter, now filled with the struggling bodies of his fellow cadets, made him feel something he hadn't felt since the storm began. Hope. The worst was still yet to come, but Joran had proven something to himself. He could survive, and maybe, just maybe, he could help others survive too. The storm continued its violent assault on the planet, a relentless force that seemed determined to claim every cadet who dared to challenge it. Inside his small shelter, Joran could hear the howls of the wind as it tore across the icy expanse, the snow piling up against the walls with every gust. His muscles ached, his body numb from the cold, but the pressure to keep the others alive weighed heavier than any physical discomfort. He was no longer just trying to survive for himself. Now, he was responsible for others. And that responsibility came with its own burden. Silara, the insectoid cadet with 8 limbs, was the first to stir. Her body trembled violently as she lay curled up in the corner of the shelter, her once pristine armor cracked and battered. Joran watched as she shivered, her mandibles clicking in a soft, almost inaudible rhythm. Her breathing was labored, and her eyes fluttered open only briefly, before closing again. Joran knew she wouldn't last much longer if he didn't do something. He had no medical training, no healing devices, only the basic survival knowledge drilled into him back on Earth. Still, he wasn't about to sit idly by and watch her suffer. Joran reached into his survival pack, feeling the cold fingers of panic tightening in his chest. He pulled out what little he had left, a few protein bars, a heat pack, and some emergency rations. Silara's breathing was growing more shallow by the minute, and he knew he had to act quickly. Without thinking, he unwrapped one of the bars and broke it into smaller pieces, trying to force it into her mandibles. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open, but there was no strength in her movements. Calder, Joran called out quietly to the stone-skinned cadet who was huddled in the opposite corner of the shelter. She needs warmth, something to stabilize her. Calder, his skin pale and cracked from the cold, looked up with tired eyes. His voice was hoarse. We don't have enough resources, Joran. We're barely holding ourselves together. Joran clenched his jaw, not willing to accept defeat just yet. I know, but if we don't try, we'll lose her. His eyes flicked to the others. Ivra, the cadet with magnetic abilities, was unconscious, his body shivering uncontrollably. And the Alara twins, once so full of energy, now lay motionless, their bodies frozen by the harsh cold. The weight of the situation settled on Joran's shoulders like a heavy stone. He couldn't bear the thought of losing anyone else. His mind raced as he searched for a solution. There was nothing left in his pack that could help. He thought of the only resource he had left: his own body heat. Without hesitation, Joran moved to Silara's side. He positioned himself next to her and carefully, gently, wrapped his arms around her fragile form. The cold was unbearable, but he didn't care. He pressed her closer, willing himself to absorb the chill from her body. He knew that if he didn't keep her warm, she would succumb to the cold, and he wasn't about to let that happen. Hours passed in a haze of freezing cold and dwindling hope. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind howling like a wild animal on the hunt. Joran's limbs were stiff, his body trembling uncontrollably, but he didn't move. He couldn't. He had to stay with Silara, even if it meant sacrificing his own comfort, even if it meant he, too, would fall victim to the storm. The shelter was no longer enough to protect them from the brutal cold. The walls groaned under the weight of the snow, and the wind continued to push against them like a relentless force of nature. Was then that the first sign of hope came. Silara's mandibles clicked again, more steadily this time. Her body still trembled, but her breath had steadied, and her eyes opened fully for the first time in hours. She looked at Joran, her insectoid features weak and pale, but there was something in her gaze that wasn't there before. "Gratitude. You saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Joren didn't respond. His throat was tight, and his words felt caught in his chest. He had saved her, but he knew the battle wasn't over. There were still others to save. As Silara slowly regained strength, Joran turned his attention to the others. Ivra, still lying unconscious, needed immediate help. Joran crawled over to the magnetic cadet, feeling his exhaustion seep deeper into his bones with each movement. His breath was shallow, his body numb, but he didn't stop. He gently lifted Ivra, cradling him against his chest as he moved back to the corner of the shelter. The storm outside intensified again, the wind ripping through the makeshift walls of their shelter. Joran's teeth chattered as he huddled with Ivra and the others, trying to preserve as much body heat as possible. But even with Silara warming slightly and Ivra stabilized, the situation remained dire. The cadets' bodies were too weak to withstand the storm much longer, and Joran knew he couldn't keep them all alive by himself. As his own strength began to falter, his thoughts turned to the harsh reality of survival. The storm had claimed so much from them already. He had saved Silara, and perhaps Evra, but what about the others? What if it wasn't enough? Joran's mind swirled with doubt and fear, but then he heard it. A weak cry from the far corner of the shelter. It was Calder, the stone-skinned cadet. His eyes were wide with panic, and his body was seizing up from the cold. Joran's heart clenched as he moved to his side. The stone-skinned cadet was on the verge of collapse. There was no time to waste. With every ounce of strength he had left, Joran grabbed Calder and helped him into the center of the shelter, pressing his own body against his to provide warmth. The storm raged on outside, but Joran refused to give up. One by one, he kept them alive. One by one, he fought the storm, sacrificing his own well-being to keep the others alive. Through sheer determination, Joran held the group together. Storm was unrelenting, but Joran had made his decision. He would not let them die, not today. His actions, simple as they were, had changed the fate of those around him. In the midst of the deadly storm, a hero had emerged. And that hero had one goal: survival. The storm had finally slowed, but the devastation it left behind was undeniable. Joran could hear the wind shifting in the distance, still cold and biting, but the ferocity had lessened. He lay huddled on the cold floor of the shelter, his body aching with exhaustion, his limbs numb from the relentless assault of the cold. The others were still alive, but barely. Silara had regained some strength, her breathing steady now, but the deep, jagged crack in her armor was a reminder of how fragile they all were. Ivra was still unconscious, his chest rising and falling weakly, as Joran did his best to shield him from the chill. Calder had stopped shivering, but his pale skin was still a sign that he had come dangerously close to succumbing to the storm. Every cadet in the shelter had been touched by the storm, each one struggling to survive in their own way. But Joran couldn't help but feel the weight of their collective survival resting on his shoulders. The faintest light began to filter through the snow outside, a dim, almost ghostly glow. The storm wasn't gone, but for the first time in days, it seemed to have eased, even if only for a moment. Joran's mind, weary and battered, tried to focus on what to do next. His body screamed for rest, but he knew there was no time. The shelter was fragile, packed with bodies, and the snow outside was still shifting, pushing against the walls with terrifying force. If it collapsed, there was no way they could survive. Joran crawled to the entrance of the shelter, forcing his stiff body to move. The cold hit him immediately, the icy air seeping into his bones like 1,000 needles. His vision blurred as he squinted into the storm. He could see little more than a few meters ahead, but the faint outline of the snowfields in the distance gave him a momentary sense of clarity. The storm had passed, but it was still unforgiving. He had to do something. His hands, shaking from the cold and the toll of exhaustion, grasped the tarp at the entrance and pulled it back, just enough to check the stability of their shelter. It was holding for now, but Joran knew they couldn't stay here much longer. The others had made it this far, but he couldn't risk them staying in a shelter that might collapse under the weight of the snow. He had no choice. He had to dig another shelter, one that would hold them all. The idea was daunting, even more so than the last time. His body was broken, his energy reserves depleted, and yet there was no other option. The storm could come back at any moment. He needed to build a second chamber, something that could hold them all, something sturdy enough to withstand the brutal environment outside. With a grunt, Joran pushed himself to his feet, his body protesting every movement. His legs trembled as he staggered to the snowdrift, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Every step was painful, his muscles stiff and aching from hours of huddling together in the cold. But he couldn't stop. He had to keep moving. He sank his hands into the snow and began to dig, the effort excruciating as the cold seeped through his gloves. The snow was dense, heavy from the storm's fury, and Joran's movements were slow, deliberate. He knew that if he stopped for even a moment, the cold would consume him. His hands, raw and bleeding, moved faster, shoveling the snow aside with determination. The shelter had to be large enough, strong enough to hold everyone. He couldn't afford to be weak now. There was no time for self-pity, no room for doubt. The wind howled around him, but he kept digging, carving out a space that would save their lives. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Joran's body began to shake with exhaustion. His mind blurred with fatigue, but he pushed on. Every movement was a battle, but he didn't stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the new chamber began to take shape. It wasn't much, just enough to fit a few bodies comfortably, but it was something. Joran's breath came in ragged bursts as he moved back toward the shelter, his legs nearly giving out from under him. He had to move quickly before the wind picked up again, before the storm's fury returned. When he crawled back inside, he was met with exhausted, grateful eyes. Calder was the first to look up, his expression softening when he saw what Joran had done. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Joran's actions spoke louder than words ever could. Slowly, Joran helped each cadet from the cramped shelter into the new chamber. One by one, they crawled in, their bodies stiff-butt. Alive, Joran moved to the entrance of the new shelter, pulling the tarp over it to keep out the cold. The walls creaked, but it held. For the first time in what felt like forever, the shelter was stable. Joran collapsed into the corner of the new shelter, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had done it. He had built a shelter strong enough to hold them all. But the job wasn't over. The storm wasn't finished yet. He still had to keep them alive. His body screamed for rest, but Joran's mind was already focused on the next step. The air inside the shelter was thick with the breath of 7 cadets, all huddled together. In the cramped space, they were alive for now. And that was all that mattered. As the storm continued to rage outside, Joran closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of relief. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that they might make it through. He had survived, and they had survived together. That was what mattered. It wasn't just about building shelters or fighting the storm. It was about the will to keep going, no matter how hard it got. And in that moment, Joran knew that no matter what happened next, he had passed the final test. The storm had pushed him to his limits, but he had emerged stronger for it. And so had they.